It was a night drenched in dreams, filled with hopes, laughter, and promises of forever. The grand ballroom was aglow with the soft shimmer of crystal chandeliers, and the faint hum of a string quartet played in the background. For Emily Harper, it was the night she had been waiting for. A day that would forever mark the beginning of her life with James Anderson, her high school sweetheart, her true love. Emily had been planning this wedding for over a year, sparing no expense to ensure every detail was perfect. From the ivory lace gown that hugged her curves to the luxurious flowers cascading down the aisle, everything was immaculate. She looked at James with adoration as he stood before her in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, his eyes full of love and admiration. To the world, they were the perfect couple. But as the night went on and the guests danced, drank, and reveled in the celebration, something began to stir in Emily's gut, a sense of unease. She had noticed James sneaking glances at one of her bridesmaids, Clara Thomas, a longtime friend from college. Clara was beautiful in her own right, with jet black hair and striking green eyes, and she had always been an outgoing presence in their circle. But something about the way Clara smiled at James made Emily uncomfortable. When the party started to wind down, Emily, full of excitement, told James that she was going to get ready for their wedding night, to prepare herself for the start of their honeymoon. She had planned for them to leave for a private getaway, a quiet retreat to the mountains. But first, she needed a moment to catch her breath. As she left the ballroom, the hair on the back of her neck stood on end. Something was wrong, a feeling she couldn't quite shake. Emily slipped into her bridal suite, her heart racing. She walked over to the mirror, adjusting her makeup and fixing her veil. But then she froze. From the corner of her eye, she saw a flicker of movement. Slowly, she turned her head toward the bathroom door, which was slightly ajar. The muffled sound of laughter reached her ears. She approached cautiously, her steps slow and deliberate. What she saw through the crack of the door would haunt her for the rest of her life. James was sitting on the edge of the sink, his hands buried in the hair of Clara, who was kneeling in front of him. Her face was hidden, but the intimate act they were engaged in was unmistakable. James's head tilted back, eyes closed in pleasure, and Clara's hands were firmly placed on his thighs. It was all too clear. Emily stood frozen in shock. A wave of nausea hit her, and she felt dizzy. She had just witnessed the ultimate betrayal. The man she had promised herself to, the man she was about to marry, was not only cheating on her, but doing so with her own bridesmaid, right under her nose. The thought of it churned her stomach. But it wasn't the sight alone that broke her. It was the feeling of complete helplessness. The betrayal cut deeper than she could have imagined. As her legs buckled beneath her, she stumbled backward, falling onto the plush carpet of the suite. The pain in her chest was unbearable, and tears blurred her vision. It felt as though the very air around her had turned to stone. Suddenly, the door opened. Clara stood there, her face flushed, eyes wide in surprise. She immediately wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, clearly embarrassed, but not ashamed. James followed behind her, still trying to adjust his tuxedo, his eyes catching sight of Emily. For a moment there was silence. The three of them stood there, frozen in time, as the weight of the situation settled in. "Emily, James began, his voice shaking, but Emily raised a hand to stop him. "You," Emily choked on her words. "How could you? After everything, after all of this." The betrayal was raw, like a wound that had just been inflicted. Emily's heart felt as though it was being crushed under the weight of her own emotions. She could barely look at James. She couldn't understand how he could betray her in the most unforgivable way. Clara opened her mouth to speak, but Emily's cold stare silenced her. "Get out," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible, barely holding back the flood of tears that threatened to escape. "Both of you, get out of my sight." The two of them exchanged glances, but neither of them protested. Clara, with her lips still swollen, slowly turned to leave, followed by James, who cast one last glance at Emily, regret flickering in his eyes. But Emily didn't care. The image of them together would be burned into her memory forever. Emily stood there staring at the door they had just walked out of. The pain was almost unbearable, but what Emily didn't know was that this night would be far from over. It would be a night of decisions, decisions that would change the course of her life. As the door clicked shut behind them, the room fell silent. And in that silence, Emily made a choice. She would make them both pay. The hours following Emily's confrontation with James and Clara were a blur. She could barely breathe, let alone think. The stifling silence in the room echoed her pain, as if mocking her. Emily moved around mechanically, her hands shaking as she packed her bags. She knew what she had to do. There was no going back now. The love she had once felt for James was dead, and with it, any remnants of trust. It had all been shattered in a single unforgivable moment. But as she packed, a dark thought began to take root in her mind. The pain inside her twisted, transforming into something cold, something sharp. Her breath quickened as the idea of revenge began to consume her. Emily could still feel the sting of betrayal, her heart aching with every breath she took. She had given James everything, her heart, her trust, her future, and now he had broken it. He had humiliated her in front of everyone. But Emily knew one thing. She wasn't going to let him get away with it. She wasn't going to let him live his life as though nothing had happened. No, she would make sure that James would feel the same hurt she felt. She would make sure that Clara would never forget what she had done to her. As she zipped up her suitcase, Emily stepped back from the vanity where she had been packing. Her eyes fell on her reflection in the mirror. She looked beautiful, no doubt about it, but she didn't recognize herself. She had been a naive bride, believing in the fairy tale of her wedding day. But now she was someone else entirely, someone with a purpose. The night had gone horribly wrong, but it wasn't over. The future she had imagined with James, gone. But there was still a chance for Emily to take control. She wasn't going to leave without ensuring they both suffered. The wedding was still ongoing, the sound of music drifting through the walls, signaling the after-party was in full swing. Emily knew she had to act quickly. She couldn't let this drag on any longer. She grabbed her phone from the bedside table and made a quick call. It was a number she had never dialed before, but in that moment, she knew exactly who to contact. "Hello," came a gravelly voice from the other end. "It's Emily. I need your help," she said, her voice steady but laced with urgency. The line was silent for a moment, and Emily could feel the weight of the conversation pressing in on her. "Help with what?" The voice was cautious, but knowing, as though they had anticipated this moment. "With making James and Clara regret this night," Emily said flatly. "I want them to feel the pain they've caused me. I want them to suffer." There was another pause before the voice responded. "I can help you with that, but you need to understand. Once you start down this path, there's no turning back. It'll be over for them." "Are you sure?" "Yes," Emily replied without hesitation. "Do whatever it takes." The person on the other end of the line chuckled darkly. "Consider it done." She ended the call and stood still for a moment, a rush of adrenaline pulsing through her veins. The plan was set in motion, and there was no turning back now. Emily's next move was a silent one. She slipped into her wedding dress once again, the gown feeling heavier than it ever had before. As she left the bridal suite, she made her way down the hall to where the after-party was taking place. The laughter and the music grew louder with every step, a reminder of the celebration she was supposed to be part of. But her mind was no longer focused on the guests. Her attention was entirely on the man and woman who had betrayed her. James was probably somewhere nearby, likely making his rounds, as brides and grooms often did. And Clara would be hiding in plain sight, no doubt trying to avoid the wrath of Emily's gaze. Emily entered the ballroom, feeling every pair of eyes on her. The last thing anyone expected was for the bride to return to the party after everything had unfolded. They probably assumed she had run away in tears, unable to face the harsh reality of what had happened. But they were wrong. Emily wasn't running away. She was stepping into her power. She scanned the room, searching for James. It wasn't long before she spotted him, standing near the bar, talking to one of his friends. He looked as though nothing had happened, as if he had just had a few too many drinks. But Emily saw through the facade. His eyes darted around nervously, as though he could feel her presence. Her eyes then shifted to Clara, who was standing at a table with a glass of champagne in hand, chatting with a group of guests. She laughed softly, completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit her. Emily's fingers clenched into fists, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had a plan, and she would execute it perfectly. James noticed her first. His face paled, and for a split second, He looked as though he wanted to run. But before he could move, Emily spoke, her voice cold and controlled. "James," she said, her tone like ice. "We need to talk." The room fell quiet. Conversation stopped as eyes turned toward the couple. The tension was palpable. James shifted uncomfortably but nodded, signaling for Emily to follow him. "Where is Clara?" Emily asked, her gaze sharp. James hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "She's over there, talking to some guests." "Look, Emily, I'm so sorry. I never meant for you to—" "Save it," Emily interrupted, her voice low but lethal. "You'll have plenty of time to explain your little affair once everything is over." James's face turned a shade paler. "What are you talking about? Emily, please, let me explain." But Emily wasn't interested in explanations. She had already made up her mind. Her voice was steady as she continued. "I think it's time we end this little charade. Don't you?" As she finished her sentence, Emily caught the eyes of the person she had contacted earlier. He had slipped into the party unnoticed. His presence was quiet, but his look was intense, calculating. James was about to say something else when suddenly the lights in the ballroom flickered and then went completely dark. The guests gasped, some screaming in surprise, others muttering in confusion. The chaos that followed was exactly what Emily had anticipated. It was in this dark, disorienting moment that Emily made her move. The darkness in the ballroom was almost suffocating. The flickering lights had cut out completely, leaving everyone in an uneasy stillness. Whispers and muffled voices filled the air as the guests fumbled around, adjusting to the unexpected change. Some people reached for their phones, trying to use the flashlights to illuminate the space, while others stood frozen, unsure of what was happening. Emily didn't flinch. The moment the lights went out, everything was falling perfectly into place. She had thought ahead, ensuring that the situation would escalate when the time was right. Her mind was clear, her purpose sharp. It was no longer about saving her marriage or salvaging the evening. It was about ensuring James and Clara would never forget the pain they had inflicted on her. She took a step forward, moving toward James and Clara's direction. The disorientation caused by the blackout only worked in her favor, as it created confusion and panic. It was exactly the type of environment she needed. Her eyes, now accustomed to the dimming light from phones, scanned the ballroom. There, near the back, she saw Clara's silhouette, her blonde hair shining faintly under the flickering light of a phone. James was beside her, looking tense, his posture defensive, as though he knew Emily was coming for him. She moved silently through the crowd, her footsteps hardly making a sound on the thick carpet. She could hear the pounding of her heart in her chest, but she forced herself to focus. This was the moment when everything would change for them, when they would realize the price of betrayal. Emily's plan was simple: expose them both publicly, force them to face the consequences of their actions, and make them feel the weight of her wrath. She wasn't just going to yell at them or cry. No, Emily had something far more devastating in mind. She had calculated every move, every detail. When she reached the center of the ballroom, the lights flickered back on, casting a dim glow over the crowd. People were still disoriented, but they began to notice the tension in the air, the unnatural stillness that hung between Emily, James, and Clara. "James," Emily called out, her voice cold and commanding, cutting through the noise of the crowd. James's head snapped up. His eyes, wide with panic, locked onto hers. He opened his mouth to speak, but Emily raised her hand, silencing him. "I know what you did," she said, her voice carrying throughout the room. "And I know exactly who you did it with." Her gaze shifted to Clara, who now stood a few feet away, looking uncomfortable but trying to maintain her composure. Clara's eyes widened, and she took a hesitant step back. She knew what was coming, and her mind raced, trying to figure out how to salvage the situation. "Emily, please," James began, his voice shaking with a mix of desperation and guilt. But Emily wasn't interested in his apologies. "No," she interrupted sharply. "You don't get to say anything. Not after everything." The room had gone completely silent. Every eye in the ballroom was on them. The guests, still in shock, exchanged whispers, wondering what was going on. Some were confused, unsure of the severity of the situation, while others were starting to piece it together. The tension was thick, and Emily reveled in it. "You Emily began again, her voice lowering to a chilling tone. You were supposed to be my husband, my partner, but instead you betrayed me. You humiliated me, and for what? A cheap thrill with one of my closest friends? Her words cut through the silence, each syllable filled with venom. James's face paled even further, and Clara looked around, trying to gauge her escape. But Emily was too far into the moment now. She wasn't going to let them get away. I don't want your explanations, James, Emily continued, her hands trembling with rage, because there's no explanation that could make this right. But don't worry, I've got something far worse planned for you. The crowd was still watching, hanging on every word. No one dared move, no one dared speak. Some of the guests seemed uneasy, sensing that things were escalating into dangerous territory, while others were waiting for the dramatic conclusion that Emily had promised. James was finally beginning to break down. His shoulders slumped and his eyes darted around, looking for a way out. Emily, I made a mistake, he muttered, his voice weak. I never meant for it to get out of hand. Emily stepped forward, closing the distance between them. Her face was inches from his now. She could see the fear in his eyes, the regret, but also the defensiveness. He wasn't truly sorry, not yet at least. The realization hit her hard. He was sorry he had been caught, not for what he had done. I'm glad you're finally realizing the consequences, but don't think for a second that I'm going to let you off easy. You don't get to destroy everything we built and walk away unscathed. She turned her gaze to Clara. And you, she said, her voice dripping with disdain, you were supposed to be my friend. You were supposed to have my back. But instead, you decided that betraying me was worth the risk. Was it worth it, Clara? Clara opened her mouth to speak, but Emily raised a hand, stopping her. Clara's lips trembled, and her hands wrung together in a nervous gesture, but there was no sympathy in Emily's gaze. There was only coldness. You're going to pay for this, Emily said, her tone final. Both of you. At that moment, Emily's phone buzzed in her pocket, a signal. It was the confirmation she had been waiting for, the final piece of her plan. She pulled it out quickly and unlocked the screen. Without saying a word, she tapped a few buttons and pressed the phone to her ear. I'm ready, she said quietly, just loud enough for James and Clara to hear. Before they could respond, the doors to the ballroom suddenly burst open, and a group of uniformed officers entered. There were several of them, their badges gleaming in the low light. The atmosphere in the room shifted immediately, the tension growing heavier. James and Clara looked toward the officers in confusion. What is this? James demanded. Why are they here? Emily didn't flinch. She took a step back, letting the officers move forward. I think you two should answer to them now. The officers approached, their demeanor professional but firm. One of them, a seasoned investigator named Detective Alice Rivers, stepped forward, her eyes scanning the room before locking onto Emily. She gave a small, knowing nod. Emily had done her part. James Anderson and Clara Thomas, Detective Rivers said in a clear, commanding voice, you are both under arrest. The room erupted in shock and whispers, but Emily stood silently, her expression unchanged. She had known this moment would come. The consequences were inevitable. The officers would take them away, and they would finally face the repercussions of their actions. The next morning, Emily sat in the dimly lit room of the local police station, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The events of the previous night felt surreal, like something out of a nightmare. The officers had removed James and Clara from the ballroom in front of the entire guest list, their faces twisted in confusion and disbelief. For Emily, the moment was oddly satisfying. The sting of betrayal still burned, but the seeds of vengeance she had carefully planted had finally sprouted into something far more permanent. They would face consequences. She had ensured that. Detective Alice Rivers sat across from her, her gaze sharp but understanding. Emily hadn't spoken much since the arrest, not to anyone, and Detective Rivers was giving her space. But now, as the investigation began in earnest, Emily would have to relive the painful details of the night that had changed everything. Are you sure you're ready for this, Emily? Detective Rivers asked softly. I know this is hard, but you're the key to understanding what happened last night. Emily nodded, her eyes distant. I'm ready, she said quietly, her voice still shaky but resolute. The truth had to come out, and if it meant confronting her own pain to make sure James and Clara paid for what they'd done, then so be it. I need to ask you a few things, Detective Rivers continued, leaning forward slightly. Last night, did you suspect anything before you caught James and Clara? Emily took a deep breath. The image of James and Clara together, the betrayal so raw, flashed through her mind. Her stomach twisted, but she forced herself to speak. I had suspicions, Emily said, her voice catching slightly. James had been acting differently for weeks. He was distant, preoccupied. And Clara, she was always too eager to be around him. I know it sounds paranoid, but I started to feel like something was off. There were little signs. I ignored them at first, but last night, when I saw them together, I realized everything I had been feeling was true. Detective Rivers nodded. And when you saw them in the bathroom, how did you react? Emily closed her eyes for a moment, the image still vivid in her mind. She had wanted to scream, to run out of the room and never look back. But instead, she had frozen, staring at the scene before her, unable to comprehend the reality of it. I felt like I couldn't breathe, Emily said, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't know what to do. I just stood there. I thought, this can't be real. But it was. I saw them. I saw what they were doing. The pain was still raw, but Emily continued. I wanted to confront them right there, but I couldn't. Not then. I just ran away. But I knew I wasn't done. I knew I couldn't let them get away with this. I had to make them understand what they'd done to me. Detective Rivers scribbled notes, her expression professional. And what happened after the confrontation? You spoke to them in the ballroom, but then... I told them both to leave, Emily interrupted, her voice hardening. I couldn't even look at them anymore. I didn't want to be anywhere near them. I had already made up my mind. I was going to make them regret it. That's when I called in the favor. Rivers raised an eyebrow. The favor? Emily gave a small, almost bitter smile. Let's just say I had a friend who owed me a favor. Someone with resources who could help me make sure they didn't get away with this. I don't have the power to do it alone, but I knew how to make it happen. I had the right people on my side. Detective Rivers looked thoughtful for a moment. And you didn't think about calling the police earlier? About telling someone what was going on? Emily paused. The question hung in the air, and it took a moment before she answered. I couldn't. I felt too humiliated, too betrayed. I couldn't just go to the police, not without proof. I needed to confront them, make them face me, but I also needed to make sure they would pay for what they did. I didn't want them to just apologize and pretend nothing happened. Rivers nodded slowly, understanding the complexity of Emily's emotions. And when the police arrived, you were ready to take action. What exactly did you expect to happen? I wanted to expose them, Emily said, her tone sharp. I wanted everyone to see them for who they really were. I didn't want to be the woman scorned in private. I wanted them to experience what I felt. I wanted them to lose everything, and that's when we arrested them, Rivers said, her voice calm, but with a hint of curiosity. What do you think the outcome of this will be? Emily leaned forward in her seat. She had been stewing over that question for hours, and the answer came easily. I don't know what will happen to them legally, Emily said with a cold smile, but I know they'll never be the same. No matter what happens in court, this will follow them forever. Everyone will know the truth. They'll never be able to escape the consequences of their actions. They've ruined everything. And I'm done. Rivers paused and studied Emily for a moment. You're sure about this? There's no going back now. I'm sure, Emily replied. They deserve everything coming to them, and I'm not sorry for that. Rivers leaned back in her chair, nodding slowly. All right, we'll do what we can to build a case, but you need to understand that while you've done what you could to get the truth out there, the legal process won't be as simple as it seems. There are a lot of factors to consider, both with James and Clara's actions and your involvement in the situation. Emily frowned, but Rivers's words weren't lost on her. She knew there would be consequences for her actions too. Revenge had its price, but at least she was no longer the only one who had to carry that weight. As Emily stood to leave, She felt a sense of finality settle over her. The pieces of her broken life were still scattered around her, but now she had control. She had ensured that James and Clara wouldn't walk away untouched. Their betrayal would no longer be hidden in the shadows, and they would be forced to reckon with it. For Emily, there was no turning back. The investigation would unfold as it would, but she had done what she needed to do. She had taken the power back. Days after the dramatic events of the wedding night, the investigation began to take on a life of its own. The police had made their arrests, but things were far from straightforward. Detective Alice Rivers had begun piecing together the fragments of the case, but she knew there was more to the story. Emily's actions were unorthodox, and her involvement in the confrontation couldn't be ignored. Still, Rivers couldn't deny the gravity of what James and Clara had done to Emily. The court of public opinion had already made its judgment. News of the scandal was everywhere, online, on social media, and in local tabloids. People were already calling it the wedding that went horribly wrong, and they had barely scratched the surface. Detective Rivers had gathered enough to begin questioning James and Clara further, but there was one more interview she needed to have. Emily had been cooperative with the police, but Rivers could sense that the truth was still shrouded in the web of emotions and hidden motives. Emily's desire for vengeance had been clear, but how far was she willing to go? Was she a victim seeking justice, or had she taken things too far? The sound of her office phone ringing pulled Rivers out of her thoughts. She picked it up swiftly, already anticipating the weight of the call. "Detective Rivers," she answered. "It's me. I think you need to hear this," came the voice of her partner, Officer Sam Martinez. "We've got some updates on the evidence from the scene, and there's something you should know about Emily." Rivers leaned back in her chair, her mind already racing. "What are you talking about?" "I've been going through the security footage from the ballroom, trying to track everyone's movements during the blackout. You'll want to see what we found. There's something strange. Emily, she wasn't just standing there when the lights went out." Rivers's pulse quickened. She had suspected there was more to Emily's involvement in the night's events, but now she was being told there was something to be uncovered. "Where's the footage? Send it over." Minutes later, the video file was on her screen. She played it carefully, reviewing the moments when the lights flickered and then cut out. There was Emily, clearly visible, standing near the back of the room when the lights dimmed. She was surrounded by a group of people who were startled by the power failure. But as the lights went completely out, something changed. Emily's silhouette moved quickly, too quickly for someone who had simply been startled. The video showed her moving toward James and Clara's direction with purpose, as if she was waiting for this exact moment. When the lights flickered back on, there she was, standing in front of James and Clara. She hadn't just been reacting to the blackout. She had been planning her confrontation all along. Rivers paused the video and rewound it, staring at Emily's movements. There was no doubt in her mind that Emily had orchestrated the scene. The timing of her advance, the way she positioned herself to make sure all eyes were on her. This wasn't an impulsive outburst. This was something far more calculated. "What the hell was she thinking?" Rivers muttered under her breath. Emily hadn't just been a victim in this scenario. She had been playing the game, and it seemed she was in control every step of the way. James and Clara were both being held at the station, their separate interrogation rooms silent, waiting for the inevitable. Neither of them had yet fully processed what was happening. They had been taken by surprise the moment the officers arrived. The arrest was swift, but now, in the sterile quiet of the station, they both had to face the reality of their actions. Clara sat in the small room, her arms folded tightly across her chest, her lips pressed in a thin line. She hadn't spoken much since being brought in, and now as she stared at the stark walls, the weight of what had happened sank in. She had never intended for it to come to this. She had always felt a pull toward James, something she had ignored for years, but it was never supposed to happen like this. She hadn't planned for the wedding, for Emily to find out. She hadn't expected to be caught in such a cruel public way, but now Clara was stuck, and Emily wasn't about to let her get away with it. A knock at the door broke the silence, and the door opened to reveal Detective Rivers. "Clara Thomas?" Rivers asked, her voice steady. Clara looked up, her expression a mixture of guilt and fear. "Yes, that's me." Good, Rivers said, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. She sat down across from Clara and folded her arms across her chest. Let's talk. Clara's eyes flickered toward the window where James was being questioned. She had already seen him from a distance, and there was no doubt he was having a hard time of it. But Clara wasn't about to make it worse for him. Not that she had any control over it now. They had made their bed, and now they had to lie in it. I don't know what you want me to say, Clara said, her voice shaky. Yes, I was with James. Yes, I, she faltered, her throat tightening. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I never meant for anyone to get hurt. Rivers watched her closely, her sharp eyes never leaving Clara's face. You didn't mean for anyone to get hurt, huh? Tell me, Clara, how do you think Emily felt when she saw you two together? Betrayed? Humiliated? Clara's gaze fell to the table. I know what we did was wrong, but I never thought it would come to this. I've always had feelings for James. It was a mistake. Rivers leaned forward slightly. You think it was just a mistake? A little affair? A little betrayal? Do you understand the damage you've caused? Clara was quiet for a long moment. I don't know how to fix it. I can't fix it. Emily, she hates me now, and I don't blame her. I ruined everything. Meanwhile, in the other room, James sat alone, his hands gripping the edges of the table, his mind racing. He hadn't expected any of this. His life, once so certain and secure, had come crashing down in a matter of hours. Emily's face still haunted him, the shock and hurt in her eyes when she confronted him. He had tried to apologize, but he knew it was too late. The truth was out, and there was no hiding from it now. Detective Rivers entered his room without knocking, and James's eyes shot up to meet hers. She studied him for a moment before speaking. You're in a mess of your own making, James, Rivers said coolly, taking a seat. Clara's already admitted to everything. She was in on it with you, but I want to hear it from you. James swallowed hard. I didn't mean for this to happen, he said, his voice strained. I never wanted to hurt Emily. But I did. And I can't take it back. Rivers raised an eyebrow. That's not good enough. You don't get to ruin someone's life and just say sorry. You've destroyed a marriage. You've humiliated your bride, your wife. What do you think happens now? James's face twisted with remorse. I know I messed up. I just don't know how to make it right. Rivers studied him, her gaze sharp. You can't. Not anymore. Emily's revenge had begun in a dramatic and very public way, but now the pieces were falling into place. James and Clara were unraveling under the pressure, and the police were building their case. But what no one knew yet was that Emily's actions, though seemingly victorious, might have set off a chain of events far more complicated than anyone could imagine. The walls were closing in on them all. The weeks that followed the wedding scandal felt like a blur to Emily. The police had been working tirelessly to build their case against James and Clara, but every time she thought she was closer to closure, something new emerged that dragged her back into the storm of betrayal and hurt. There were interviews, legal consultations, and a wave of media attention that felt both suffocating and strangely satisfying. It had been weeks since James and Clara's arrests, and the reality of what she had done, what they had all done, was beginning to set in. Emily had sought revenge, sure, but in the process, she had unknowingly started a chain reaction that would change everything. Detective Alice Rivers had continued her investigation, and Emily had been called in for additional statements. She knew she was a key witness, but the more she sat in the police station, answering the same questions over and over again, the more she began to question if the truth really mattered anymore. She had been the one to expose James and Clara's affair, but now as things unfolded, it seemed the damage had gone beyond just them. The media was the first to pick up on it, publishing sensational headlines about Emily's public shaming of her husband and his lover. There were accusations thrown around about her involvement in orchestrating the dramatic confrontation at the wedding. Had Emily lured James and Clara into that confrontation? Was she seeking retribution, or was she simply a victim of a toxic marriage? The public didn't know what to believe, but they were quick to pick sides. Some felt sympathy for Emily, understanding the pain of betrayal, while others questioned her motives, labeling her actions as manipulative. In the courtroom, the preliminary hearings had begun, and the small, overcrowded courtroom was filled with a buzz of anticipation. Emily sat in the back, her hands tightly gripping the edge of the seat in front of her back straight and rigid. She had to be strong. She had to be resilient. But the whole situation felt like a nightmare unfolding before her eyes. James sat on the other side of the courtroom, his face drawn, his eyes hollow. He hadn't been able to look her in the eye since that night, since everything had been laid bare. Clara, too, sat in the front row, her gaze lowered, her fingers nervously twisting the fabric of her blouse. There were still people in their corner, family members who were willing to stand by them, but the weight of what they had done hung over them like a dark cloud. Detective Rivers stood in front of the judge, presenting the case. She spoke clearly and calmly, outlining the events that had led to James and Clara's arrests. Emily had given her testimony, but this was where the real investigation began. The courtroom was now a battleground, a place where every word would be dissected and scrutinized. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Rivers began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen countless cases unfold. "What we have here is a case of betrayal, deception, and the destruction of trust in a marriage. We have a husband who, for reasons known only to him, chose to cheat on his wife with her best friend. And when the truth came to light, the wife took matters into her own hands." The mention of Emily taking matters into her own hands made her stiffen in her seat. She had not expected to hear her name spoken with such finality. Emily hadn't been the one to choose this course. It had been James and Clara's actions that had forced her to act. But she knew that in the eyes of the law, she was just as much a part of this drama as they were. Rivers continued, outlining the key moments of the wedding night, how Emily had caught them together, the way she had confronted them publicly, and how her actions had led to James and Clara's downfall. There was no denying that Emily had been the catalyst, but she wasn't just a passive observer in all of this. She had made a choice, and now that choice would be examined and perhaps judged. Outside the courtroom, the media circus surrounding the trial was relentless. Every day, reporters waited outside the courthouse, cameras in hand, asking questions that Emily had no interest in answering. There were people who wanted to hear her side of the story, but most of them only cared about the drama. They wanted to know if Emily had been justified in her actions or if she had gone too far. They speculated endlessly, but Emily was exhausted by their questions. She had given interviews to local news outlets, trying to explain her side of the story. It wasn't about revenge, she told them. It was about justice, about reclaiming what had been stolen from her. But her words fell on deaf ears. The public didn't care about her pain. They wanted a story, something to hold on to, something they could feel good or bad about. They didn't care that her marriage had been destroyed, that her trust had been shattered. They just wanted drama. In the midst of all this chaos, Emily found herself beginning to question the price of what she had done. Had her pursuit of justice blinded her to the real consequences of her actions? The court was where everything was supposed to play out, but the outside world had already made its judgment, and as much as Emily wanted to believe she had taken control of the situation, there was a gnawing feeling deep within her that she couldn't shake. What if she had made things worse? Back in the interrogation room, Detective Rivers sat across from James, who was now an emotional shell of the man he had been. His face was gaunt, his eyes dark and tired from sleepless nights. The case had taken its toll on him, emotionally, physically, and psychologically. He had never imagined his life would end up like this. And now, as the reality of the consequences settled in, he couldn't help but feel the weight of his mistakes. "I know this hasn't been easy," Rivers said, her voice more empathetic than usual. "But you need to understand something. You had a choice and you made it. And now Emily has had to live with the consequences of that choice." James stared blankly at the table. His hands trembled, but he didn't have the energy to hide it anymore. He wasn't the confident, composed man who had walked into that wedding hall weeks ago. He was broken, and he knew he had no one to blame but himself. "I never meant for it to get this far," he said hoarsely. "I swear. I never thought Emily would find out like this. I didn't want to hurt her, but I did. I destroyed everything. And now, Rivers prompted, her voice calm. James looked up, his eyes filled with regret. And now, I'll never be able to fix it. I can't take back what I did. I can't make her trust me again, and I can't undo the damage that's been done. Rivers nodded. You can't undo it, James, but you can own up to it. You can start by telling the truth, every last detail. And if you do that, maybe you can begin to make things right, at least in some small way. Back in the courtroom, the trial was in full swing now. Emily sat quietly watching as the events of her life unraveled before her eyes. The defense attorneys for James and Clara had begun to argue their case, but the evidence against them was overwhelming. James's confession had sealed their fate, and Clara had already admitted to the affair. As the days passed, Emily realized that this wasn't about winning or losing. It wasn't about who came out on top. It was about the truth. It was about the raw, ugly reality of betrayal and how it had shattered her life. No matter the outcome of the trial, there would be no going back. The damage had already been done, and nothing would ever be the same again. The courtroom was almost eerily silent as the trial neared its end. Emily sat at the back, her face a mask of quiet determination, yet her insides churned with anxiety. The past few weeks had been a blur of legal jargon, emotional testimony, and endless media coverage. Every detail of her private life had been dragged into the light for everyone to see, and she had little control over how it was being portrayed. Despite all of this, Emily knew that this moment, the closing arguments and the jury's final verdict, would shape the rest of her life. Detective Alice Rivers, having worked tirelessly to piece together the truth, had seen the case from every angle. She had witnessed the devastation that had unfolded from the moment the wedding night's confrontation had turned violent. Now, with all the facts laid out, it was time for the final chapter. But even Rivers knew that this trial wasn't just about criminal justice. It was about something much more profound: the human cost of betrayal. The prosecution had built a strong case against James and Clara. Both had admitted to their roles in the affair, and the evidence surrounding the wedding night confrontation was undeniable. The security footage had been damning, showing Emily's calculated movements leading up to the moment the lights flickered out and the confrontation began. But there was more to it than just the affair and the public shaming. There was a woman who had been betrayed by the two people she trusted the most, and her actions, though extreme, had been fueled by that betrayal. In the courtroom, James's defense lawyer, a sharp and well-dressed man named Thomas Gray, had spent much of the trial trying to downplay the significance of Emily's actions. His strategy was clear. He needed to shift the blame, to make Emily seem just as responsible as James for the chaos that had ensued. His argument was that the confrontation, while regrettable, had been set into motion by Emily's own feelings of anger and jealousy. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Gray said, his voice smooth and calculated, "what happened that night was tragic, yes. But let us not forget the role that Emily played in escalating the situation. She is not just a passive victim here. She is an active participant in the drama that unfolded. Her actions, her need for revenge, pushed the situation to its violent conclusion. She could have walked away. She could have made better choices, but instead, she chose to humiliate and attack her husband and his lover." The words stung Emily deeply, and for a moment, she felt as though she might crumble under the weight of the accusation. The defense's arguments seemed to strip away everything she had tried to hold on to. The idea that she had been justified, that she had been a woman wronged, a woman seeking justice. Instead, she was now being painted as the villain in her own story. But Rivers, who had been sitting at the prosecution table, watched Emily carefully, sensing the emotional toll the defense was taking on her. The detective had spent enough time with Emily to understand her, to know that her actions, while extreme, were born from a deep sense of betrayal. Rivers believed in the complexity of human emotions, and she knew that what had happened wasn't just about revenge. It was about pain, loss, and the breaking of something irreplaceable. Rivers stood up, her presence commanding attention as she began her closing remarks. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her tone calm but firm, "what we are here to address today is not just a betrayal of trust, but the consequences of that betrayal. What James and Clara did to Emily was unforgivable. They stole from her the very foundation of her life, the trust she had placed in them. What happened on that wedding night was not just a violent outburst. It was the result of a betrayal so profound that it shattered Emily's sense of self. Rivers paused, her eyes scanning the jury, making sure each one of them understood the weight of her words. I ask you to consider what you would do if you were in Emily's shoes. What lengths would you go to if your partner and your best friend not only betrayed you, but did so on one of the most important days of your life? Emily's actions may have been extreme, but they were the result of deep pain, anger, and heartbreak. And while no one can justify violence, I ask you to consider the context. Consider the human emotions behind her actions. The room was still as Rivers concluded. This is not just a case about right or wrong. It's about understanding the depths of human emotion, and it's about seeking justice for a woman who had her world torn apart. The jury deliberated for what felt like hours. Emily sat, her mind racing. She had no idea how this would end. In some ways, she wanted to walk away from it all, let James and Clara carry the full weight of their actions. But she also knew that no matter the verdict, this trial would never give her back the peace she once had. Her life, her trust, and her love had been shattered, and no jury's decision could ever undo that. The following afternoon, the jury returned. The courtroom was packed. Friends, family, reporters, and members of the community had all gathered for the final moments of the trial. As the judge entered the room, the tension was palpable. "Will the jury please rise?" the judge asked, his voice steady. The jury foreman stood, holding a piece of paper in his hand. His eyes scanned the room briefly before looking down at the judge. "We, the jury, find the defendant, James Mitchell, guilty of adultery and Clara Thomas guilty of aiding and abetting the affair. However, in regard to the charges against Emily Mitchell for the assault, we find the defendant, Emily Mitchell, not guilty of the criminal charges." A murmur rippled through the room as the words sank in. Emily's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment it felt like the room was spinning. Not guilty. She had been absolved of the charge that had loomed over her for weeks. It wasn't a clear win. There was no perfect closure. But it was something. The judge nodded solemnly. "The court will proceed with sentencing for the charges against James Mitchell and Clara Thomas. But as for Emily Mitchell, the court finds no grounds for criminal charges in this matter." Emily blinked, trying to process the enormity of it all. The weight that had been pressing on her chest for so long, the suffocating fear that she might be convicted of something she hadn't wanted to do, was finally lifted. James and Clara, on the other hand, stood motionless as their own verdict was read. The judge didn't mince words when it came to their betrayal. They had been found guilty of adultery, and the court would soon decide their sentences. The consequences of their actions had come to light, and they would have to face the repercussions. As the court session ended, Emily stood up from her seat. She felt a strange numbness wash over her. Relief, but also a deep emptiness. This chapter of her life was far from over. There was no happy ending, no simple resolution. What had been broken could never be completely repaired. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Emily, shoving microphones and cameras in her face. But she walked past them, her head held high, refusing to let their questions define her. She had survived the storm, and now,